You're listening to Adventure Party for the second week of March 2022. This week, go west, young GM, and bring some hex paper with you. The Adventure Party, discussing tabletop and radio gaming the Irish way. Welcome to the party. I'm Scarr.
I'm Dave.
And I'm Savage.
And this episode, folks, we are marching. We are marching in a particular direction. Can you guess what direction that is, folks?
Go west, they said.
Mm-hmm.
To the marches, they said.
Yeah. Gotta use those feet, get your cardio in. So, I think the first big thing when broaching the topic of a Westmarches game is, what's a Westmarches game?
Yeah.
And I would like to start by asking each of you. So let's start, Dave. What is, off the top of your head, don't check Wikipedia or Stock Exchange or anything, what is a Westmarches game as far as you know?
As far as I know, it's not a fixed player base, or there is a pool of players, but the actual party that shows up on a given day is comprised of the people's characters that can show up on that given day. So you're adventuring with whom you're adventuring with, as opposed to the same few people. And yeah, it tends to be associated with sandbox play, as in this an area to start exploring, say a march. And yeah, that is about the extent of my limited knowledge on the matter.
Savage, without being biased by what Dave said in any way, what is your definition of what a Westmarches is?
So, I have to be absolutely honest here, because I am what I would consider critical innovator, and I tend to kind of march to the beat of my own drum. So, if you'd asked me that question 10 minutes ago, I would have told you, like an astounding dullard, that I have absolutely no idea. I would have guessed, is it something kind of sandbox that takes place in a region that the players explore? And I might have gotten a half a point for that answer. I have a better idea now, and what I have to say is I fully recognise what a Westmarches game is. A lot of what Dave says is apparently true, but I would never have known to call it that. And I didn't really think of it as a style of game, but I guess we'll codify anything in the world of RPGs, so I had absolutely no idea. I just didn't know. I'd heard the term before, but at this point, I was too afraid to ask.
Okay. So you're both wrong. Or rather, I should say, your answers are incomplete. Now, this is the thing about terminology in the RPG space. Everyone loves to co-opt it and throw it around, and, you know, every character I don't like is a munchkin syndrome is very common in these cases. So you have to... terminology this naturally gets muddy. But I have my personal definition, and this is going back, seeing a lot of different people react to the term Westmarches and what the original concept by, I believe, a blog called Ars Ludi.
Not ringing a bell.
Well, yeah, it's the guy, he wrote a whole bunch of those storytelling games, like, I can't even think of the names of them now, but like the game where you sort of define a timeline as a sort of storytelling. Anyway, it's ARS space LUDI. So as far as I can understand, there are 3 elements to a Westmarches, and different people will leap on 1 or maybe 2 of these elements and grab onto those and saying that this is what Westmarches is. But there's actually 3 layers to it. So the first one is the sort of sandbox or hex crawl element of it. You have your perfectly safe starting location where nothing ever happens and there's no adventure there, so get out of there and go looking through the dangerous parts for stuff to do. So you'll have your hex map or some kind of overland travel system and a whole bunch of dungeons or adventure locations dotted around some less civilized, or at least not easy to traverse space. There you go, and you know, the stuff to find here, stuff to find there. Ideally there's some kind of connection between all of it, but different sites are sort of separate, and so on. So, you know, there's a sandbox exploration element to it. Second is the other element you guys honed in on, both of you notice this very quickly, is the idea of an open table. This is like you don't have a fixed player base. You have like 20, 30 players, and only 5 or 6 of them will get together for a game at a time. And you might never play with the same group twice. It's just who is available on the day gets together, and that's the group for this session. We'll see what we get done in this session. If you don't get everything you done in the next session, that's what point 3 is going back to. But the session ends. You get back to town of perfect safety, and you part ways, or you go back to the guild hall, and you may never adventure again with that same group. And the third element, and this is, I think, possibly the most interesting one, but also the one everyone seems to overlook. All adventures are player-driven. The GM doesn't organize sessions. The players do. You have your group of 20, well, you don't need 20, but you have your open group table, and they're back and forthing on Discord or an email group or whatever, and there's going, well, I'm free on Thursday night. The GM is free on Thursday night, or one of the GMs if you're in a multi-GM system. And I want to go to the Temple of the Black Mask and find to see, is inside that secret room where the 3/4 of the dungeon we can't find, is it in that secret door that we just barely found at the end of the last game? Who's with me? And it's on the players to define what they're doing on the session, who's going to be going to do it, and, get together, what's our objective, what's our goal, what are we doing in our 3 to 4 hour slot. And the GM takes that, goes, right, I'm free on Wednesday or Thursday or whatever, preps that content, and then the players show up to do that thing and pursue that goal. And that, I think, is the most overlooked part of a Westmarch. This idea of player-initiated action and player-organized sessions. And the reason that it's very hard to do is because it's nightmare for a GM who doesn't have 3 or 4 nights free in a week.
Yikes.
Because I'm using the players' definitions of when they're available. Oh, and it's just was it like this? The thing is, this sort of gameplay style sort of emerged out of a particular pioneer. I think his name is Ben Robbins, the Ars Ludiae guy. 2 B's in Robbins. He was in a particular part of his life where he had loads of free time and was free 3 or 4 or 5 nights in the week, and he wanted a game, but he didn't want to just prep an ordinary game. He had too many people to run separate games for, so he organized this system. When are you free? Am I free again? Do we need a rest for this one? And getting the players to organize it took the part he didn't like, organizing and wrangling these cats, and let him focus on what he did want, which is prepping cool dungeons for his players.
Oh, I was under the impression this was a Gygaxian thing. I didn't realize it was some other lunatic innovator.
Well, as we've discussed many times in our Tome of Gygax episodes, I feel like Gygax would probably have had elements of this, but that's because Gygax just sort of had so many natural advantages of just letting people come over to his house and annoy his wife and sit in his gigantic back room with his huge table, and whoever was available at a time, they would sort of grab, because infamously he was running 6 nights a week for tables of 10 players, each with multiple characters, and that was his environment. So while certainly there are certain elements that this is but yeah, that's sort of where Gygax naturally did, because he had his 12 level mega dungeon. I think it was initially 12, and then they expanded it to 30 or something along those lines. But yeah, he sort of naturally fell into that mode because that was, he was in a particular position of, I am not doing anything most nights except this game. It's our new moneymaker, TSR. So why would I not be running it all the time? And he had his mega dungeon, which had the natural advantage of, well, if you know all the tricks to get down to the level that you want to really quickly, you can get down there with only a couple of wandering monster checks and have a whole bunch of big adventures in a couple of hours going after the treasure you want. It became this setting where the more a particular group played, the more they would know about the dungeon, and how to explore it, because they were, instead of a hex crawl, they had a dungeon map to explore. That was their sandbox. And different people would have different knowledges of, well, there's a shortcut here that gets you down to level 5. And if you go to this room, there's a secret door that you get go around all the beholders to get to the dragon treasure. So when a random group got together, they would each have a unique experience because each of them had learned different things in the dungeon. So yes, it is a bit Gygaxian, but I don't think Gygax... An awful lot of what Gygax, quote-unquote, designed was just sort of what he discovered was naturally useful for him in play, as I've said many a time on our Total Gygax episodes.
So, but we're giving Ben Robbins credit, is what we're saying here, to codify the Westmarch, which, can I take it that some more of this takes place above ground than the sort of normal dungeon delve? Or is that a misconception?
I think, as we've said, it can sort of go both ways. Like, there certainly needs to be some element of sandblock exploration, because otherwise, if you're on a linear path of, well, you're doing the dungeon, you're doing what I say, regardless, it loses that sort of player-driven objective thing. Where if the GM defines an objective, or, definitely the only plot line is we are doing the mystery of the snake goddess, then there's not a whole lot of flexibility what the players want to do.
Right, yeah. Snakes all the way down.
So you can't indulge, say, like, 3 players. Well, I got notes in Magician's Lair last session when I was playing with players A and B, that there are 7 magic swords in the Tomb of Necrotic Fever. And I know that to get to the Tomb of Necrotic Fever, I'm going to need players E, F, and Z. So I'm going to email or private message players E, F, and Z, and just saying, hey, how many of you need magic swords? Can we pool our resources and go to the Tomb of Necrotic Fever and get the swords? Because I really want that magic sword. I have intel saying it's got this, it's got that in it. Presumably, you guys are interested. And that part of between session negotiation of the player group sort of negotiating back and forth, I want to do this, I want to do that. What are we prioritizing? Who's going where? Who's doing what? It sort of makes you realize, this is possibly the kind of thing where all of a sudden Gygax's ominous rattling about records of time must absolutely be kept, starts to make a little bit more sense, because you have one party running off to Tomb of Necrotic Fever, the other one's in the Temple of Snake Goddess,
What? Yeah, there's some overlap in the styles there. Okay, that's pretty good explanation of what it is. Do we like it?
Sounds like it would be easier in some ways to organize, since you wouldn't be tied to, well, we can't, like, Joe's narrative arc is critical to the story and he's not available for 3 weeks. Like, it would avoid situations like that, which is already an advantage. And I suppose it does lean into a certain amount of focus on what's interesting to the players who are at the table.
Yeah, it's differently difficult to prep, or no, not difficult, but like it would suit some people's prep styles more, because some people are happy enough just go. I plot out the entire map, pick all of my dungeons, plot them here, here, and here. I've done all this work over years. I have a full sandbox setting ready to go. But others would be like, I guess there's hills here, there's a marsh. I kind of like there being ghouls in the marsh. Maybe there's halflings over here on this hill. And they would really benefit from a bunch of players saying, I want to go to the marsh, I want to kill the Ghoul King, I want to take the Ghoul King's scepter. And it's just like, okay, right, that means I have 3 days to flesh out the marsh, get my swamp navigation rules and random encounter tables ready to go. And start out the Ghoul King in a scepter. But at the same time, then because organization is somewhat out of a GM's hands, it requires them to be able to, a GM to have the free time necessary to be flexible enough to handle their players. This is not going to work if your player is like, if your GM is like, I'm only free on Saturday nights. Who's free on Saturday nights? Oh, Jimmy and Lisa and Bimbo. Well, or Bimblo. I
think that's kind of how you fall into a regular play group, right?
Yeah.
And gets us to where we kind of are today. But I can absolutely see the attraction of this. Some of it just sounds like an MMO on paper, and in many ways, that's kind of what early MMOs set out to be, or MUDs even.
Before the WoW crisis, and in a very similar manner, the very low tech but very in depth and customizable MUDs were supplanted by a very interesting, visually flashy but very shallow content train of WoW, where you come in, you say, all right, here's my daily quests, here's my plot line, here's my expansion, here's the monster that drops the loot I want 1% of the time. Okay, I can just focus on nice repetitive tasks.
We'll get letters if we jump straight from MUD to WoW. I mean, there's Dark Age Camelot and a whole bunch of other things that happen in between, but I take your point. Let's not relive the... Was it the early 90s? Was it? No, it wasn't that far back.
MUDs were around from the late 80s until the late 90s was when the Ultimate Online and Dark Age of Camelot were strong, and then I think it was 2004 was when WoW came out.
Something like that. Okay, so it's got this on-call GM aspect to it that I imagine is going to be the hardest bit to implement after you pass a certain point in your life, unless you are dedicated to the high art of game, because the Pilates classes creep in, the artisanal glass blowing that you like to do of an evening, the visits to the Burns ward for those orphans you failed to save. That all takes up time. See previous episodes. It all takes up time. So being on call, I imagine if you could find a stable of cooperative GMs who want to kind of attempt this, like there's 2 or 3 of them rotating around, the logistics are you either doing it all online, which these days not impossible, or you're sort of within a locale, and anyone who's hosting the game has enough room for the kind of 4 to 6 that are going to show up. But it is, I mean, all of those are doable. So this is kind of cool. I do love, and I sense that there's a de-emphasizing of the player's story, in the sense that no one's going to take your elaborate backstory and weave it in to the same extent that they might when you're with a regular group with a regular schedule and maybe a more narrative-focused GM, or the GM's laying out most of the campaign for you, and you're consuming it. And I do like the sort of TV show. We start and we finish in town, and we write it up and let everyone know what happened. I like that kind of episodic aspect of it as well. Should Westmarches, this is a question that popped into my head, do Westmarches games sometimes end mid-adventure and you come back for another session, or you got to get it done? What's the ideal?
Oh, that's where you get debates. Like, some people will say the GM starts tapping the clock, or maybe some campaigns will have ticking clocks, where it's just looks like the mists are coming. Don't want to be out of sight of town when the mists come. But yeah, if you're doing a more naturalistic thing and you just go, oh, I was supposed to get my last bus 10 minutes ago, I need to run aspect, then you can find yourself a little bit out of the lurch and having to go, well, I guess everyone rolls on this table to see if they get out of the dungeon or if they have to lose D3 limbs.
Time management becomes really important, and but it's still doable. Really interesting stuff.
Well, to bring your point about narrative, it's not backstory that drives it. It's your actions, your goals. It's goal oriented. So you don't come saying, I want to slay the king and avenge my father. You're okay, this is my profession, and this is the part of this setting that I find cool. I want to go here, investigate this mystery. I want to look up these notes that we found at the Wizard's Tower, or I want to get that magical ring that I heard about when we were in the secret room in the Temple of Necrotic Fever.
Dave, you wanted to speak to the narrative. I mean, are we abandoning player narrative, or?
I had a notion, if you're going to bring up your player character's narrative, you need to do it in a way that's actually going to appeal to other players. As in, look, my estranged uncle who's a terrible bad person. It has a castle around here. He's threatening peasants, and he's probably got a bit of loot. And I would really, really appreciate some help taking care of him. Who's up for it? And if it's not a clear-cut thing of, that's a really dangerous location in the middle of the swamp of desolation or what have you, you're going to, the player might have to do some, player-to-player diplomacy, as in, I know it's going to be a bit tough, but, we'll get X, Y, and Z out of it, the locals will love us, etc., etc., etc. And you could have some interesting dynamics that way, but you can't just expect, spoon feeding of plot points and story beats where just because you have a background, doesn't mean it's going to come up.
Yeah. See, part of the premise is that nothing of interest happens in the safe town or safe location or guild portal or Stargate or whatever system you have to insert players into the sandbox. So, there's no amount of going around all the local toughs in the bars and shaking them down that will reveal anything about where your uncle is, where his secret castle is, how many trolls he has in his dungeon, etc. You have to find that out by going to different places around the hex-crawly part, around the Westmarches, and go look for clues. And the GM is meant to put clues and connections between locations all around the thing. So for each clue you want, you presumably, going back to the old rule of threes, you'll probably want to have 3 different locations of different levels where information about each dungeon should lead to each other, I guess is what I'm saying. Or have clues scattered around.
That sounds interesting.
I really should stop making comparisons to computer games, but this does strike me as being almost exactly the layout for the Pathfinder Kingmaker game that I think came out last year. In fact,
it does have a bit of a feel of
you
that.
You even go west on the map to play that game into the Bandit Kingdoms, something like that. So, I take it it's always into undiscovered or unexplored territory. You're not going to deal with presumably another established nation next door that'll just be invading, right? This is sort of into the hinterland to bring civilization, or at least the threat of it, to whatever you find there. So how can you play a Westmarches game without a big pool of players? Can your group, say, like a lot of people are listening to this, probably not sitting around in 1970s college towns with big living rooms going, there's about 30 people I know that'll play. Is there a way to get the Westmarches feel with your group?
I just feel like at a certain point that will just become a standard sandbox game. There's an emphasis on making it more episodic, and there's an emphasis on it's not the GM's plot, it's the GM's world, and the players sort of zone in on what they are interested in that plot. Is it a magic item? Is it a particular enemy they want to get rid of? Just pieces of information are going on. Are they shaking down the goblins for intel, or do they just not like Great King Warty Bum?
Right, yeah. I think because there's certain defined conceits to the mode, I think you could probably adapt some of this to a regular group. But it, of course, does allow you to open the door to irregular players. If you're not ready to go full Westmarches, you can at least say, "Oh, my mate Bob or Karen, they don't always have that night off, but they're free every second Thursday. So, will we do a Westmarches and sort of have their character in?" And maybe there's another player who say, "Well, I'm going to go to my uncle's bar mitzvah." Pretty sure that's not how that works, but so I won't be there though. You're less reliant on the same exact group of people, but you have some flexibility.
Well, the structure sort of feeds and enables that sort of swapping in our characters. But then you have to ask questions about, well, do they come on with level 1 characters and get smoked when they go to the Temple of Necrotic Fever and just, die from the fumes? And then this comes back to your Gygaxian model of, well, maybe it'd be simpler if we made first level characters and just went into one of the first level dungeons and see if the the goblins have the new goblin queen has who's replaced the old one, and how are they doing these days? Let's have a nostalgia with new characters going back to an old location or something.
Right. Oh, that's kind of cute. Yeah, I have to say, reading over a description of it, it does fill me with nostalgia for those days when I could potentially have taken part in Westmarches games, because we were just knocking around with some, like, let's just lay some cards on the table. This, in its purest form, is a style of game for people in their 20s who are probably going to college or hanging around with a lot of other. They're tied into a gaming sphere somewhere, be it through college or work or through, local game store or whatever. That's who this is for. If if you've got a mortgage and a couple of kids, and you're really making inroads in the glass blowing, do not apply it.
Well, you wouldn't want to be the GM.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to be running this.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to be the GM, but you would want to possibly be one of the players.
Yeah, it might suit you down to the ground. I'd love to drag Zauseed in, because I know for a fact he did run this style of game back in the day, and I'd love to get his thoughts on it. And I would note that it eventually turned into a regular game with a few regular players that had been sort of gone through that funnel.
Yeah, I think that is sort of the main issue with Westmarches, and perhaps you could even apply it to the history of role playing as general, is that the stresses of life, and as the game goes on, and some people want to dip in and out once every few weeks, and there's one person who wants to play every single session and seems to have literally nothing else to do. And, the chaos of, well, this week I'm going to be running a game on Wednesday and Friday, next week I'm going to be running one on Monday, the week after it's going to be Wednesday and Thursday. That can play havoc with a GM's schedule. So there's always these little nasty pressures that let you push you away from this model towards the traditional. We can have the same 4 to 6 people every week on one night, which is agreed ahead of time, and we prep content for that group and go through what they're interested in, and that becomes the story of our campaign. And that's sort of the weakness of Westmarches, and maybe of role playing in general, is that
we can't get away from the fact that these are the 4 to 6 people you can stand to play with on the regular.
Oh yeah, because that again, like I haven't done this well, but I have done open table play. I have gone most nights I run for my fixed group, but once every few months in Galway, I would run an open night where I just pick out like Into the Odd and just first level dungeon and just invite anyone in, and you would get a very mixed clientele of people, and some of them would be nice, genial, and come on board, and some would be wacky and disruptive, and sometimes I would say if I had people coming in, I would let them guest stars NPCs in my regular game, and there's a couple of stories there. I believe Dave knows the story of the time they were invading a Zinchian temple, and one guy just took a whole bunch of drugs and started trying to dismantle their chimera, and they had to wrestle. They were in the middle of a fight with a dozen Zinchian demons, and then someone had to go and wrestle the machine gun away from this guy who was tripping out of his mind.
Yeah, look, these things happen. Actually, speaking of that, that slot, there was a GM who was running a drop-in 3.5 game set in Dark Sun, and the system wasn't a million miles from Westmarches, although not nearly as open-ended, because he rolled up the encounters outside of game time. We were basically all caravan guards, and whoever was playing that night was on duty that night, which was the mechanism by which it was the players being having their characters involved. And it was interesting. It doesn't fit the technical description of Westmarches, but I would imagine it got inspired by it, or something very similar to it.
Shares a lot with it, yeah.
It worked in the sense of it gave something that there was something for people to play who just sort of shown up and were interested in a game, any game, but it didn't have that same level of, well, this is our setting and our objective. We're going. It was just sort of casual in and out. Let's see what happens. Let's take drugs and steal a machine gun, sort of shenanigans. And it became harder to become invested in it. I know I played a few sessions of it, but after one character just sort of got mobbed by ghouls, and I think the rest of the party just abandoned him, was just like, okay, that was a game. I'm not really. I guess we're just going to go through endless horrible things and lose characters. And it's just like, that's fun if you just want to play for its own sake. But I wasn't particularly interested in it as a long-term thing. So I just kept running my own game.
So it's a game style that if you don't feel the need to get particularly invested in characters, or perhaps want to try out a bunch of different types of characters, that you could, if you can find a Westmarches game, then it's probably a great place to do that. I'm intrigued. Now, obviously I said at the start of this I didn't have a damn clue what a Westmarches game was. Obviously I'd looked it up. One thing that jumps out to me is this idea that while yes, the GMs are doing a lot of prep work, which they're pre-warned about, there's an onus on players who take part in these things to write up the sessions and share those session reports. Is that a key part of this?
It certainly helped. It certainly is a dynamic seen an awful lot where people say, well, if it's just a bunch of random nobodies coming in and out of town, then the party, it just feels very disconnected from each other. But if there's information sharing, and you sort of have this provision that these are specific people who have signed up to be part of this investigation process, or they're guards for the town, or they're some kind of adventuring guild, and they might not necessarily cooperate all the time. Maybe someone wants to be raced to be first to get the magic swords, or try to organize a session ahead of someone else's session so that they get a certain clue first. But the provision is that you're still all sharing information, so that the group as a whole is still making not story progress, but world progress. They're learning more and more. They're learning as a group.
And there's a chronicle of what's going on.
Yes, and that means that as new locations get revealed or hinted at from one person's investigation, those become available targets for the next person's investigation. So you'll have players A, B, and C go to the Wizard's Tower, and they hear about it. The Craves of Crystal have all the magical power I need. And it's just like, well, we'll let everyone know. And then players B, D, and F, they go off and they find the crystal claves or whatever. Each group's play enables others' play. And, there's still overall progress of the party. Even if each individual party member is sort of trying to wheedle in, so I'll get the magic sword first, or I'll get the spell, or so on and so forth.
Presumably the location of that sword is an interesting thing to know, that players may or may not share with each other.
That's the difficult one. Like, do you want this environment where players say they have secrets and only reveal those secrets for payment? Now, that might be more realistic, but it might be difficult to do, if you want to have a long-term group with, feelings about each of the characters. Like, maybe you want there to be the chance for PvP. That's certainly how Gygax would have done it, where a given group might be very secretive about some subsection of the dungeon they found, and they wouldn't tell anyone about it until they cleared it out and made sure they got all the goodies. But Gygax was Gygax, and he was surrounded by veteran wargamers and impressionable children, so you notice that this didn't come out of the more modern, more cooperative gaming, where we're all in this together, guys. Why are we having conflict? Conflict is what I play games to get away from.
I think it would make for an interesting level of intrigue, with a big enough pool of adventures to draw from. You would get that classic trope of rivaling adventuring parties.
Yeah, maybe you want that.
A little bit of friendly rivalry or intrigue, can be fun.
Absolutely.
Between players, but yeah, so long as it doesn't get out of hand, sure.
Well, look, as long as there's plenty more meat on the table, it's just going to be, we've one-upped you this time, but in the background you're secretly working on on a deal to share information about the Necromancer's Tower that a third group has discovered last week, but they're not going to be able to play again for a while, so maybe you can get a few people together. Hell, maybe you can even entice one of your rivals' team away to make up the numbers. After all, it's every adventure for themselves at the end of the day out in the West Marches. I think it's got huge potential. I think the thing I'm most intrigued by, if you can unlock this, it makes it more viable, is a set for a cooperative cabal of GMs who will take on this project and share that cognitive load, first in terms of populating the initial map, and then in terms of taking these forays out into the West Marches for different groups of players, because it does give you more opportunities for groups to run, for different groups to run in the same sandbox, and for overlap between groups, and hell, even for different styles of GMing to find their place. So I think 3 GMs who were sharing the load on this and could cover a good part of a week, say 5 out of the 7 days, or hell, maybe even just 3 will do, would make a Westmarches campaign more than possible. Yeah. If they've got a shared interest, as long as they don't fall into the old co-writer's trap of both having entirely different ideas of what should be in those hexes.
Yeah. You'd probably want to have one, I don't want to say master director or storyboard producer or something, but you probably want to have someone who's the final say when something is contradicted. Yeah,
look, you sit down with a pint, you hash it out. You agree that the creepy woods are where the ghouls and vampire stuff takes place, and that the Eldrin fields then are where the Fae stuff can happen. And maybe there's some interesting interface on the board of those, but styles of games will go on these different places. That's you get some cowboy in my space opera sort of thing. Right, it's an interesting. I've certainly learned a bit. I've had a lot more to think about. It's a style that kind of underlies a lot of the sorts of games we read and played. But if you take what would you call them? The mantras, the
3 things: the exploration,
the pillars, yeah.
Yeah, the exploration, the flexible table, and the player-driven organization. Yeah, it's a question of can you take individual ones? Do maybe you only want one pillar? Maybe you have a fixed story and a fixed group, but you want the players to be the ones to say, we're going to investigate this lead next session, so we can't swap and change that now. It's just tell the GM what to prep. Maybe you just want that rather than having your players meander around your plot. Maybe you have a fixed group that just wants to see what go with the flow, but you still want a sandbox game of neat things for them to find. Or maybe you have one story and one session a week where you play, but you don't mind whoever shows up can play. These are things that only one person can subscribe. I feel, as I say, people latch onto different elements of this West Marches to see what fits them, because not everyone has the position in their life and their player base to pull off the perfect quote-unquote or authentic quote-unquote West Marches experience. You're going to pick on things. I'm considering my next game that I want to have different players maybe show up every session and they have a different experience. But I'm not as certain that I want it to be player driven from a narrative section. I would say I want to say 1 or 2 players this evening, maybe 2 or 3 players the other evening. But I've been thinking maybe this would be some kind of Conan-esque. A different thing happens every week. One session you're a Viking in the mountains, and the other you're dying of thirst in the desert, and we'll see what adventure happens to you. So is that West Marches? It's got elements. It's organized for the players out of game, but it's very fixed, non-explory idea in game. So I'm not going to any platonic ideal, but I am stealing ideas from West Marches and wondering maybe I could organize it this way. But that's an organizational thing. It's a setup thing.
Yeah, I guess I think that there's, as a style of game, there's something to be borrowed from it, even if you can't pull it off entirely. Also, we've talked about it almost exclusively in terms of a wilderness and presumably some sort of quasi-medieval setting. But there's no reason this hinterland couldn't be a solar system or, hell, if you want to get really abstract, a newly discovered data archive full of potentially vicious AIs and things that you could sort of hack into and explore it that way. So yeah, there's lots of different ways to march west, I think, and lots of different things to recommend. At least looking at the form.
Any final thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, I know that excellent point by Mick there. I mean, the net is vast and infinite after all. Yeah, you could apply it to different settings. I suspect the main thing you'd have to avoid is say large urban areas or much of any sort of town, because that's kind of muddying the waters with you can't find information in the town ethos that they're going for. But yeah, a village of strange peoples who are doing strange rituals is another story. They may or may not be in league with the monsters. They may or may not be a way to rest up safely, in the wilderness. Who knows?
You just have to consider all that. It's just like, I imagine there are people who have managed sort of urban investigation style hex scrolls, but, again, you're sort of muddying your waters. The nothing happens in town element was meant to make sure people were exploring. Well, maybe if your town is the thing to explore, then you don't have to worry about that thing. So, yeah, that's sort of what I was getting at the start, is that the terminology is muddy because there's an awful lot in that idea. And, we're in the era of do-it-yourself RPG design, and that applies for rule systems as much as it applies for the campaigns a GM puts together. So organize as suits you, and maybe the Westmarches is too much to handle, but maybe there's a kernel of ideas for you to latch onto. Okay.
I think we've covered a lot of unexplored ground, filled in a few places on the map.
But the mists are coming in, and
yeah, it's time to get back to town.
The last bus is coming soon.
Right. So, if you have played a Westmarches style game or run one or done anything around it, hell, if you were there in '77, we'd love to hear from you on our Discord. You can find us there. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter. I've been Savage Mick.
I'm Dave.
And I've been Scarr. And this party is over. Thanks for listening to The Adventure Party. You can find show notes and links to things we've mentioned at www.theadventuringparty.net and on our Facebook page. You can leave comments there, or talk to our Twitter account at AdventuringPTY, or you can record a voice message at www.speakpipe.com/theadventuringparty. We can also be contacted directly by email at party@theadventuringparty.net. If you'd like to be in touch with the party all the time, come join our Discord server, link in the show notes. The Adventuring Party was released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike version 3 license.